when it comes to the Savior and my heavenly parents, I don't feel that way. I do feel loved by them, and I've had a lot of tough moments having to decide, how do I move forward in a culture and a church that feels like it doesn't have a place for me. And I've just received, revelation upon revelation, again and again, personal inspiration of how to move forward, even when tough things happen. The thing that has been like most beautiful to me is the way that like the boots on the ground, like my local community, cares about me and loves me.
As the cold winds of winter sweep in, there's nothing like the warmth of a comforting cup to help you slow down and unwind. This is the season. Let Postum be your cozy companion. Made from roasted grains, Postum is caffeine-free and rich with a smooth roasted flavor. It's the perfect drink for those quiet, chilly mornings. Whether you're curled up with a good book, sharing a laugh with loved ones, or simply watching the snow fall outside, a cup of Postum is the moment you have been waiting for.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to This Week in Mormons. I'm your host, Matt. Along with me is my sister, Melissa.
Yep, here I am. Hi, Matt.
Hey, Melissa. And today we have two very special guests. We have Ben and Christine with us. And we're going to start this interview talking about the Gather Conference. So, Ben or Christine, what is the Gather Conference?
I'll go first, and then Christine can go second, I guess. The Gather Conference is Christ-centered support for LGBTQ Latter-day Saints and those who love them. It's a yearly conference that happens in Provo, Utah, and this year it will be on June 27th and 28th, so coming up real soon. And we have a wide variety of presenters, speakers, LGBTQ folks, friends, allies, parents. About 40% of the people who come identify as LGBTQ. About 40% identify as parents of LGBTQ kiddos or family members, and another 20% are just friends, allies, people who want to learn. And just over 90% of attendees are active in the church. And
Wow.
So this is really about the intersection of our faith, our sexual orientation, our gender. And not only that, but there's great music, breakout sessions. It's just going to be 2 days of so much fun. And there's also going to be a podcast live event that I will be doing for my podcast. So if you want to come see me, I'm going to be there the whole time. So come and hang out with me.
Yeah, that sounds great. How long has this been going on, Ben?
This is our third year.
Okay, awesome.
And we've branched out a little bit. There's a regional conference that happens in Arizona and one that happens in North Carolina as well.
And is this one being held at Utah Valley University?
Oh, no, I wish. That'd be so convenient for me. The bus goes right there from my house. No, it's at the Utah Valley Convention Center. And I should have said this to begin with, but listeners can find more information at gather-conference.com. That's gather-conference.com for a list of speakers, the itinerary, the event space, to register, all that stuff.
Okay, and follow up, Ben, since you are our first returning interview to our podcast, is Cinnabon sponsoring the conference?
They are not, but I haven't even asked. I should swing by
you should ask.
I should swing by the University Mall and be like, "Hey guys, you want to sponsor this conference?" They'd probably be like, "Yeah, for sure."
Christine, are you going to be at the conference?
I am actually going to be at the conference. This is kind of my quasi second year doing it. The first year I actually presented at the Arizona conference. And this year I'm actually helping to organize the conference in of itself along with Ben. And I am super excited because I get to work with some amazing people that want to bring this Christ-centered focus into the Gather conference and just really support individuals wherever they may be at.
So what kinds of speakers? Because I go to academic conferences and they drive me crazy. I'm imagining something more fun than talking political science papers.
Yeah. Well, picture this. So, there's the acronym LG. Well, it's not an acronym, but, LGBTQIA plus. We have a speaker from each of the letters who's going to share a bit of their journey and how they connect with the Savior. So if you want to learn what it's like to be asexual, to be intersex, to be trans, there'll be people there sharing their experiences. Also, we want everyone to see themselves as well. We also have Jennifer Finlayson Fife, who's a well-known Latter-day Saint therapist who's going to be talking, I think, about like healthy boundaries. There's also a non-Latter-day Saint, a female bishop. I think she's Episcopalian. Do you remember, Christine? What
I believe
denomination?
I believe that's
Yeah,
right.
yeah, she's an Episcopalian bishop in Salt Lake, who is gay, talking about her experience and her faith. And yeah, so expect just a lot of story sharing and a lot of faith sharing.
I'm doing
Um,
karaoke.
yeah,
Christine, what's your go-to karaoke song?
Actually, what's really funny with this is I set up in the garage this whole setup. I have all the speakers and microphones and stuff like that. I have 4 kids, and my second and third decided to just have a blast with this setup. And so they had the projector, they had the screen, the YouTube videos, and I just let them go to town with this. They were in there for hours.
Wow.
I love
Okay.
this.
So I'm thinking, I was going to say 20 years ago, but I think I could even say 10 years ago. Something like this conference seems unthinkable to me. Like, what makes this happen? Like, why is this happening now? I mean, obviously, you guys are putting a lot of work into making this happen, but broader than that, like, why do you think this is happening now? Like, how can this be? The question is, how is this happening?
yeah. Well, this is happening because wherever there are Latter-day Saints, there are LGBTQ people. Like in every congregation all across the world, wherever there are Latter-day Saints, there are LGBTQ people, and this intersection exists, and it's important. So this started because Allison Dayton, who runs the Instagram account Lift in Love, she's a mom of a gay kiddo, and she started just like posting things for like other parents of LGBTQ kiddos, and then moms started writing back, and they were lonely, and they're like, "There's no one like me. I'm all alone." And then she started, and then that grew and grew and grew, and then she got a bunch of us together who are working in this space in different ways. And she's like, guys, we got to do something. Like, what can we do? And then the Gather conference grew out of us wanting to like build a coalition of people in the space to say, like, what do people need? And the thing that people need from the many times I've talked to people, like I said before, like I'm a therapist working with LGBTQ clients, people feel lonely. They feel isolated. They feel like there is no one like me. I'm the only person going through this. And the Gather conference is a way for us to say, no, you're not alone. There are so many people just like you. Let's build our faith together. And that's how it started, from Allison saying, all these people are alone. Like, let's not be alone. Let's be together.
Yeah, I love that. I think what somebody like me needs, who I'm not part of the LGBTQ community, directly, but what I need is permission to be supportive, permission to be like, yes, I'm a faithful member of the church, and I'm also an ally. And I think a conference like this is a great way to say, like, we're all working towards the same goal, which is just loving each other and loving Christ. So I guess it kind of feels like it gives me permission. Is that okay?
Of course. Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Melissa, I am giving you permission right now to love and support all
Well,
of
yes,
God's children.
yes.
You have my permission
Not,
as well.
not what I meant, but I feel like sometimes people are like, "Oh, I either have to choose to support the church or to support my queer friends." Sorry, my son tells me to use the word queer. That's not offensive, is it?
No.
Okay, I just wanted to check. That's the word that he says the younger kids are using. Anyways, I have to choose to, be active and support my church or to choose to support my queer friends. That is not the mode of where I want to see the church going. That's not how I want to feel in the church. So I love that we're able to have a conference like this and be like, that's not how it is, guys. That's not how it is anymore in our church, which I love.
Yeah. And
How
building off that, Melissa, I just pulled up a quote from Elder Cook. This is from an interview he did a couple of years ago, and he was asked about like, how do we love LGBTQ people in our congregations? And if the word support doesn't feel comfortable to people, he uses some great words. This is what Elder Cook says. He says, as a church, nobody should be more loving and compassionate. Let us be at the forefront in terms of expressing love, compassion, and outreach. So I love that. Let us be at the forefront in terms of expressing love, compassion, and outreach. So, I think those words resonate with everyone: love, compassion, outreach. And I think it's good to ask ourselves, what does that look like? What does it look like to express love, outreach to LGBTQ people? What does that look like?
So how would a Gather conference be different than attending a Pride event or a Pride parade?
Oh,
Christine, why don't you tell us?
Actually, I am going to my first Pride Parade this year. Every other
Oh,
year before this, I have actually been working out of town or some other event going on. And so I'm really excited to be a participant in this Pride Parade gathering and stuff like that. I was actually asked by one of the interfaith leaders to actually even do a presentation because I was the first Mormon individual to actually do that.
Wow.
And so they reached out and said, "Hey, would you be willing to do this?" Of course I will. And so it's, I even checked with my stake president just to make sure that was okay with him.
Yeah.
He's like, "Yeah, as long as you state that you are just a member, not a leader." And I'm like, "That's fine. I can work with that."
Yeah, so I want to pause here real fast because I feel like a lot of members of the church feel like they need to check with ecclesiastical leaders before participating in pride events. And I know that, Christine, for you, it's a little different, right? Because you're asking permission to represent the church sort of like in a particular way. But isn't it weird that we feel like we have to check with our bishop before we go to some kind of a pride event?
Yes.
It was so one of the slides that I'm doing for the Gather conference is I have a picture of the church on one side and science on the other. And in between, I have this diagram of just showing tension. It's this knot. And people are just getting themselves into knots over a lot of these details and asking themselves, well, how do I approach this? The next slide is taking that knot and saying, bridge. Find ways to work around that. Because we're going to have differences no matter what happens between any individual from relationship to relationship. How do we find ways to love one another, even despite our differences?
Where do you think that the tension comes from, science versus religion, or does it come from groups of saints within the religion interpreting the same things in different ways?
I think a lot of it comes from just perspectives. We take our experience, our history, our narratives, our education, and we are bringing it forward into our relationships. Whether we heard one thing or another, where we're looking at a research study that was done one way or the other, regardless of that, we're taking this information forward and we're interacting with other human beings. I'm going to be doing the same thing. Because I do a lot of research and study in this field, in the scientific fields of biology and human development. I'm taking that to this group and I'm trying to say, how do we untangle these knots? How do we bridge between what is taught one way and reflected another way?
Yeah.
And if you want to nerd out with Christine, she knows the biology, she knows the developmental stuff, and she can talk about the stuff for ages. And it's so cool that we have someone who is not just part of the LGBTQ community and an active Latter-day Saint, but also has this like deep scientific knowledge and can tie it all together. She can be that bridge.
So in political science, to geek out just a little bit, right? In political science, there's always this question of how attitudes change over time. And one of my friends wrote a paper called The Remarkable Rise of Transgender Rights. And he also studies the change in attitudes about gay rights, same-sex marriage, things like that. The thing that makes the biggest difference in attitudes about transgender individuals or gay individuals is if you know somebody or care about somebody who's transgender or gay. And I do think that to a large extent, members of our church, when we isolate ourselves from other people, or when we prejudge or we sort of make a determination about people before we get to know them, it makes problems worse. And so one thing I love about Pride Month, but the Gather Conference in particular, like if you're afraid of gay people or queer people or whatever, because you've never met any of them, go to the conference and meet people. And when you interact with other faithful Latter-day Saints, it will always build your faith. There's nothing about gathering in a faithful space that will ever challenge your faith. So I think it's really important for members of our church, if you want to show love, the first thing you do is you do what Jesus did. Jesus showed love by being with people, and you have to do the same thing. Like, don't make judgments about people until you're with them, get to know them, and then you'll find out like answers to your questions about like, is this a safe space? Is this a scary space? Just go and find out. Just like we tell people with church, come and see all of the things that are out there.
I love that. That's exactly right, Matt.
My favorite scripture is 1 Samuel 16:7. God looketh on the heart. And I think you'll find that in the LGBT community, the queer community, there's a lot of really good hearts out there.
Yeah. And one thing I appreciate about Ben, and I've sensed it a little bit from you, Christine, members of the church often want to have the answer, right? They want to know like, why is so-and-so gay? Why is la 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 la? And I love that there's not an answer, right? Like there's so many different children of God on the earth who have so many different life situations. And he doesn't spend his time telling me the answer to like, well, why was that kid raised in Africa with poor parents or what, right? There's not an answer to that. And so I really appreciate that both of you are not out there trying to answer the questions that are probably unanswerable.
Yeah. Christine, this might be a good time for you to introduce yourself to our listeners just a little bit more. Just tell us a little bit about your background. We've kind of been talking around it.
So I'm Dr. Christine Coons. I'm a physician in Spokane, Washington. I practice in internal medicine as a hospitalist. So if you ever have somebody that gets admitted to the hospital, that is where I work.
That's the only kind of physician I ever see, because I don't go to my doctor. I only see the hospitalist.
Only the hospitalist. So a couple years ago, I started really deep diving into a lot of genetics and human development study. And as a consequence of that, I have outreach to a lot of different groups and organizations, universities, and hospital systems. And so I'm actually working with the national organization Interact. We're working on several projects together, do several presentations to medical schools and universities. And then I also work with my healthcare system to present a lot of the stuff that I've been researching along with other organizations to make this accessible to everybody. There's been a huge amount of advances in genetics and biomics over the last 100 years. And it's been remarkably just amazing to me. One of my favorite things is a couple of years ago, as I started doing this, I got this epiphany moment where I was like, all of a sudden like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. And all I wanted to do was just travel the world, sit down at a cafe, drink a hot chocolate, and just people watch and go, you're amazing. Just because of who you are, whether your language is different, the skin color is different, whether you have different race, ethics, religion, education, it doesn't matter. Even if you're LGBTQIA, all of a sudden I can find people in the midst of all this research and just go, wow.
So, Christine, if you don't mind, because you researched this, I'm going to ask you questions about things I commonly hear, and then you can like let us know, is that true or is that false? But then I'd
Sure.
also love to hear like your personal story, and then some of these probably relate to you as well, Ben. But the first question I have is, people frequently tell me that a person will transition as transgender and then they'll later on regret it. Is that a common thing?
No.
That was easy.
No, not common at all. There was a recent survey, transgender health survey. It was created by transgender individuals, and they had like 97,000 individuals surveyed, and the regret rate was incredibly low, like into the single percent regret rate. And most people you will find stay as their preferred gender identity.
And there's along those lines, there's a lot of talk about parents who allow their adolescents to transition are doing some kind of harm to them, like that they should prevent, right? These puberty blockers are dangerous for their children, and like parents are maybe pushing something on their children, and that parents who really love their children will not engage in that kind of behavior.
So I'm going to actually segue into my own personal experience with this. My parents are awesome, by the way. I love my parents. They're very supporting, they're allies. And I'm a child of the 80s and 90s. Yes, I'm that old and I just dated myself. But at the same time, I grew up with DuckTales and Tailspin and stuff like that. I actually had a really good childhood, all things considered. My parents loved and cared for us. They actually, we went to church regularly. They did their best to do family home evening, pray regularly. But at the same time, I experienced gender dysphoria at an early age, very early age. And I intentionally hid it to the point where it caused a lot of harm internally, where I felt shame. And I think that's what we're trying to avoid with a lot of these youth is that sense of shame, because that's where a lot of the depression comes in, a lot of the anxiety comes in. And that's what affected me growing up. I hid because I didn't know what to do. And of course, during that time, we really had no idea what was going on anyway. I didn't have the language to articulate it, but there it was. And as I grew older and older, I realized that my coping mechanism was work. If you see my work habits now, it's a lot of work. Even if doing all these projects and research and then helping with the Gather conference on top of that, there's a lot of things that are going on in my life. So those habits have carried forward, even though I'm now actually more myself. If I were to compare myself between then and now, it's definitely the absence of shame. I feel more comfortable. I feel closer to God. than I ever had in my entire life.
Yeah.
Wow.
And that I'm really glad to hear your story. I don't think you should have to ever justify your choices and say, like you said, like, I'm closer to God now. I'm more myself now. Like, it feels ridiculous to me that we live in a world where you have to explain yourself before you're taken seriously. I think that's silly. But I do think it's important what you said about not living in shame. You talked about depression and anxiety. And I think if we're straight talking, what we're talking about is suicide, right? Like,
Yeah.
that is a statistic that is, to me, unconscionable. And so if I don't know the statistics on it, and maybe you do better, but I think, to me, when we're talking about let's not let our children or our loved ones live in shame, what we're saying is let's do everything we can to keep them alive.
Yeah.
That was my experience. I did get to the point where I did almost take my life because of the shame that I felt. And that was actually one of the few reasons of my transition.
Mm-hmm.
So I have a friend that came out as gay, I'm going to say between 25 and 30 years ago. And he told me one time that one of the most frustrating things to him when he came out as gay is that everybody thought that a gay man was a transgender man. They're like, to them, there was no difference. They're like, oh, you're gay because you're really transgender. And so
Ben?
help me know. Is that true?
Well, I am not trans. I am a gay man. So, there are these different aspects of who we are. Gender identity and orientation are different things. So, I am a cisgender man. I was assigned male at birth, and I identify as a man. And I think anyone who perceived me in the world would be like, that is a man. And that is how I identify. And yet I am attracted to men. So, yeah. So, different things. But, just a few decades ago, society's understanding of these things was really basic, and in a lot of ways can still be very basic. But we've grown leaps and bounds since 25, 30 years ago, thankfully. But there's still so much more to do. And like Elder Cook said, more love, compassion, outreach that we can do. And part of that love, compassion, outreach is listening, understanding. If someone says I'm gay, and you think, oh, so you're actually a woman, maybe we could ask some questions, and hear some stories and do some more understanding.
I like that.
Yeah. I
So-
do have a question, and you don't have to talk about this if it puts you in conflict with the church, but I am concerned about the church's transgender policies, and how they affect people who, when we say, Ben, we want to be welcoming, we want to be outgoing. I feel like currently, as the policy stands, it might be hard to feel that way at our church with some of the policies that are in place. Is that something, Christine, you're nodding your head, that you feel comfortable speaking to, or am I putting you in an awkward position?
No, I've actually shared this with a lot of different people in different groups. And there's, with that recent policy change last August, a lot of people left as a consequence of that. They just basically decided that enough was enough. I can't deal with that. And even from my perspective, I have to, and I use the word navigate a lot with this. I have to navigate with other members of the church, leaders of the church, and work through the restrictions that are placed on me as a consequence of that in the best way that I know how. And for me, that requires a lot of getting down on my knees, praying, thinking about it, spiritually working my way through this process. It's a navigating process. And there have been many times where I said, why do I do this? Why do I interact with people the way that I do? And really, it's the love of the people that I work with and the community that I help serve. I see myself reflected in them, and I want them to have a better stance in life than I ever did. And that to me is empowering. How do I give people the tools to help themselves to do better and see themselves as Christ and God would see them?
Would both of you say that you feel marginalized by the church and its policies? Would that be a fair thing to say, or no?
That is, when it comes to the Savior and my heavenly parents, I don't feel that way. I do feel loved by them, and I've had a lot of tough moments having to decide, how do I move forward in a culture and a church that feels like it doesn't have a place for me. And I've just received revelation upon revelation, again and again, personal inspiration of how to move forward. even when tough things happen. The thing that has been like most beautiful to me is the way that like the boots on the ground, like my local community, cares about me and loves me. I live in a ward that's right by BYU, so my ward is made up of a bunch of retired BYU professors and the young people who live in their basements. And one of the women I minister to, she's in her 80s, and and I'm like, I don't know what this woman will think about me being gay. And then, she asked if I was married, if I had kids, and then so just like naturally came up, and I mentioned I had written a book, and she's like, I would love to read that. And so I gave her a copy, and then afterwards she bought more copies to give to her family. And she just like whenever I see her, she just like hugs me and says, Ben, I'm so happy to have you in my life. And I feel that from almost everyone I know. They're just like, we are so glad to have you in our lives. And yet sometimes like the November 2015 policy happens that it was really painful for me. And other thing, and like the transgender policy that just happened last year can be really painful for people. And so there are these painful moments that happen that make me feel like I'm an outsider. And yet the people, the boots on the ground, help me know I love you. I claim you. You belong with me.
Yeah. What about you, Christine?
I would say the same. From my ward perspective and stake perspective, I have great relationships with those groups, and I'm really grateful for that. And I regularly talk to my stake president because we actually work together. He's a obstetric and gynecologist at the same hospital I work with. And we see each other in the cafeteria all the time. There's like workstations and stuff down there, and we run into each other regularly. So we actually have a lot of these discussions and talks. And he was recently experienced a child that was born that was intersex, and we had great conversations about what that means, what that looks like from my perspective as somebody who also works with these organizations nationally.
So if we can real quick, I know that for a lot of us, this just seems like common sense, but I know that we have listeners that do not know what intersex is. What is intersex?
So this is a hot topic, huge debate. And a lot of it actually has to come down to, you have to define intersex by defining sex, male and female. And a lot of people will use the dictionary definition of sex based off of reproductive capability. That's what's argued nationally as of right now. It's way more complicated than that. And the way that I represent this concept and topic is by looking at the groups of organs and systems that are together, that work together to make us who we are. And there's a huge list of them. I can go through them if you want, but basically the development of these structures is variable and quite variable from person to person. So I actually technically am intersex. As a consequence of my own development, the genetics and things that happen throughout my entire life make me who I am. For somebody who is intersex, it is a representation of a variation of sexual development that is outside of those realms that we've created called male and female. That was a long definition.
So you're telling me sex is not necessarily binary?
No, we in the medical field and scientific community, there is no universal definition of sex. We can force a definition. That's what we're trying. A lot of things are happening with that. But from a medical and scientific community, no, not by any stretch.
Go ahead, Ben.
Yeah. Just one thing I wanted to add that isn't along the lines of being intersex.
Sure.
You use the word marginalized, and I think if any apostle listened to this, and I don't think that they will, they would be like, oh my gosh, like we don't want anyone to feel marginalized. Like I don't think anyone wants us to feel that way. And I just see like so much like sincere goodness and love and outreach from people that I know. And even though we're trying our best, that doesn't mean that sometimes we don't hurt people. One thing that my dad says, which I really appreciate, he says, people are trying their best, and yet sometimes their best destroys your life.
Wow. That's
Wow.
And
That's true.
And it's dark, but it's true. People are acting with the best of intentions, and yet sometimes really good intentions can be incredibly painful. And I don't think that there's anyone in the church who would want people like me or Christine or any other LGBTQ person to feel like we weren't welcome at church.
Yeah. My wife was interviewing for a job at BYU Idaho, and as part of that process, she interviewed with the president of BYU Idaho. So I asked her, hey, how did the interview go? And she's like, we spent about a half hour talking about intersex. I was like, what? what are you doing? Because there's a standard question about proclamation to the world on the family. And so my wife's like, I don't know if I don't want to say he'd never heard of it before, but he definitely asked her lots of questions about, so she's sort of like discussing intersex. And then he's like, so what I hear you saying is you support the church doctrine, but you have empathy for people that don't quite fit the mold or something like that. She's like, yes. I'm like, that's not the approach I would take in an interview for a church school about that. But it's just to express that a lot of people don't understand that, right? That's a biological thing a lot of people don't understand. Along those lines, Christine, my wife, I said, what would you want me to ask Christine? Her question is this, and I think a lot of people have this question. My wife is a tomboy. She likes working on cars. She likes working in the art. She's actually the perfect spouse for me because she likes to do all the chores that I hate to do.
It's true.
And she's like, sometimes I wish I were a man so that when I went into a parts shop, they would treat me like an equal and they wouldn't be so sexist towards me. But she's like, but I wouldn't want to necessarily present as a man just for that reason. Like, how is it that transgender, because you talk about how you were suicidal or very, very depressed.
Mhm.
And I say to people regularly, if my child was struggling with depression and the solution to that problem is transition your gender identity so that that problem goes away, I would say do that. But my wife cannot understand, how does that help? Like, how does that actually fix the problem?
This can be a very long discussion. A lot of it actually, so I'm going to start with a little bit of history in our genetic understanding. And a lot of people will resonate with this because our high school textbooks, as of at least 2017, still talked about these topics. So if you go back about 1890, 1900, that's where we really started to actually delve into the world of genetics. And we got really excited about it. Gregor Mendel had his papers resurrected. We got the P's that came out. Reginald Punnett did the whole Punnett square, and 1906, the sex chromosomes were discovered. We got really excited about sex chromosomes for various reasons, but I think a lot of people use those sex chromosomes as anchors to say, well, it's only male and female. And we use that for decades and decades and decades. It wasn't until the 1950s, 1960s that we actually started branching out and saying, well, what about these individuals? What about those with Klinefelter's or Turner's syndrome? And then there's all sorts of other combinations of chromosomes that we term as aneuploidy. We're familiar with Down syndrome or Edwards and things like that. But what we're finding is that it's more of a blend than we ever thought possible. Fast forward to the 1980s, we start looking closer and closer at genes themselves. In the 2000s, we had the Human Genome Project. That was the catalyst of this rapid advancement in technology in terms of genetics and genomics. So most people will fall back on the Punnett square. They'll look at parents and say sex chromosomes fall into this camp, and you go from there. Far more complicated than that. So if you start at the chromosome level, the next level down would be the gene level. The next level down would be the epigenetic level. The next one down, we'll be talking about quantum mechanics and physics and quantum biochemistry and stuff like that. Don't have to go there.
We couldn't if we wanted to.
Right.
If you could draw the equation, please, it would be very helpful.
But what I've been focusing on is the genetic layer and the epigenetic layer. Basically, chromosomes in of themselves have no meaning. They're storage structures. You're basically a USB drive that you're plugging into a computer and it has to run a program. So when you are bringing a sperm and an ova together and creating this embryo, you're presenting data to be processed. Even though there's an X, there's a Y, you still have to go through the process of development to get to that point. Each one of the anatomic structures that help us define what sex is all about has to develop independently of each other. That also includes the brain. So the influence of hormones on the brain can actually have a varied effect on how we develop overall. And that can be somebody who is born female at birth or assigned female at birth. They can have more masculine traits or vice versa. And not only is that genetically allowed, it's expected.
So in your experience then, as you're a male child growing up, you feel like you're not being true to who you are.
Right.
Yeah.
yeah, my development was different. So I have Kalman syndrome, which is has to do with the pituitary gland, which sits right behind the eyes. The pituitary gland is an organ that helps control sex development, puberty, and things like that. Mine wasn't developed very well. As a consequence, I have some interesting features of my body that are just different. Like I have a diminished sense of smell as a consequence of that. When those pituitary cells were traveling to their intended location, they bring the olfactory nerves, the smell nerves, to their intended location. I never did that.
Yeah. So then, how long ago did you transition? Has it been 10 years? I think it was around 10 years.
I started hormone therapy in 2014.
Okay.
I officially transitioned in 2022.
Okay. So way less recently than what I thought. Okay. What was that like for your wife and for, if I should call her your wife, and your children?
Yeah, my wife and children, we're still married, happily married. And I will say 2014 was the scariest moment of my entire life. So I mentioned earlier that one of my mechanisms to help me work through the gender dysphoria was overworking myself. During residency, I overworked like crazy. So imagine residency, 80 plus hours a week to begin with. On top of that, I was moonlighting on the side. And then my third year, I was the chief resident and I had to rewrite the entire program on top of the moonlighting.
Wow.
Come March 2014, I realized that was all going to disappear. I was going to graduate. I was going to start medical practice. And I didn't have all these mechanisms in place to protect myself. And so I was standing in the kitchen. I don't remember exactly what day in March this was, but I was standing there just thinking about all this stuff. And I got this very distinct impression of, you need to tell your wife and you need to tell her now. I had never considered that in my entire life or accepting myself for who I was. I was scared stiff. But that feeling, that momentum was so powerful that I did it. I listened. And I was shaking so much on that couch. And that was my first moment of actually telling my wife. From there, it was a very slow snowball effect. And telling other people, other family members. And it actually, from prior personal experiences with my parents, I didn't tell them until a couple years ago.
Wow. And what was that like? How did they take the news?
They actually were not very surprised.
Isn't that the way it always is? The people who know you best are like, we're glad you figured this out.
Yeah.
But they were supportive and kind.
They were supportive and kind. I never actually got the strength up to actually call them personally. So I emailed my dad. And within about 15 minutes of that email to my dad, he called me up and he said, the first thing I want to say is, I love you. And
Wow.
that was very powerful and impactful to me.
So have you moved to a new community, a new ward, since you transitioned?
No, still in the same one.
So all the people that knew you before know you now.
Mm-hmm.
How have they responded?
Overall, very well. I think in terms of the congregation, no matter what I do, there's always going to be people that look at me and say, I don't want to be around that. You make me nervous. You make me uncomfortable. And I get that. This is something that's different, and I can't disagree with that. One of the things that I wanted to make sure that people knew was I wanted to make sure that they felt safe and comfortable around me. And so one of the things I do is just create spaces, safe spaces for them as well. As they create a safe space for me, I have to do the same in return.
Wow. Listen, I want to say this to both of you. I have these heroes in church history because there have always been marginalized groups in the church. You can go all the way back to the Samaritans when Jesus was on the earth, but Elijah Abel is one of my heroes, right? Given the Melchizedek priesthood. And then at some point he's told, sorry, you're black, right? You can't progress in church policy and things like that. My heroes in church history are the marginalized people because I don't think I could stick with the church if I was in that group. Like Joseph Smith one time said, I don't blame anyone for not believing my story because I wouldn't believe it if those things hadn't happened to me. I
Mhm.
sort of have a similar sort of approach that it's like, I don't know how all these people stay in the church. Like, if I didn't have the life that I have, I can barely hang on as it is sometimes. Like, it's hard to be a member of the church. I love that the two of you are hanging in there and helping other people with such grace and charity for people who don't always
Yeah.
reciprocate the same.
Thank you. You know, it's that moment in John chapter 6, I think, where a bunch of the disciples leave Jesus, and Jesus turns to Peter and says, "Will you also go away?" And he says, "To whom shall we go? Thou hast the words of eternal life." You know, it's
Mm.
it's not an easy place to be. It's not always an easy experience, but this is where I want to be.
Yeah.
Yeah. So thank you
Let
for
me
your
ask
kind
you
words.
let me ask your perspective on this. There is another thing I hear from time to time that there are more gay people there are more people who identify as gay now than there were 20 years ago. There are more transgender people now than there were 20 years ago. And some people say to me, this is a sign that the world is becoming a more wicked place because we're more accepting of alternative lifestyles. And if we could just push back on that, we could put we could get rid of all of this craziness in society. How do you feel about those kinds of ideas?
Yeah, you know, I would just say that first of all, if you look throughout history in all cultures, there are LGBTQ people. You can find queer individuals in history without looking too hard. So we have always been around. What's different now is, you know, like in the 70s and 80s, like the queer boat, like the gay boat, wasn't very big. It was like people who are exclusively like men exclusively attracted to men and women exclusively attracted to women were on this boat. And now there are more people who are identifying and being on this boat. And there's always been this spectrum of gender and sexual orientation. It's just a lot of people weren't talking about it or sharing it. And so I'll talk to people today who will say, you know, I'm bisexual. So I'm like sometimes I'm like they'll say I'm a little bisexual, and so then they get on the boat, you know, and so the boat has just gotten bigger. But in the end, the variety of human experience I think has been pretty consistent. We've always been around. We've always been here, and if you look just back in recent history, very sadly, with the AIDS epidemic in the 80s and the early 90s, you know, a lot of gay people died, and so in the 90s and 2000s, there weren't as many because people like thousands and thousands and thousands of people died. Thankfully, that's not happening anymore. But the reason that Christine and I are able to do what we do is because we stand on the shoulders of giants, people who paved a way for us to even talk about these things. But you know, you look back in the 1800s, the 1700s, the time of the Savior, there were people, there were men like me who were alive then. We've always been around. We're just we can just talk about it now. We couldn't before.
Yeah.
I'll echo that.
Uh,
Agreed.
And I think, Christine, also back to your point on epigenetics, it's not completely socialization either, right? Like,
No.
so you can have a genetic profile that might predispose you to a certain thing, but the environment determines whether that genetic profile is expressed, right? So,
So I'll use this example. So in the human, there are 21,000 genes that produce proteins. And it's not one protein per gene, it's actually thousands upon thousands of them. There are about 98,000 genes that help with the regulation of those that actually don't produce any proteins. So it's not, if you look at our human development, 21,000 genes is not enough to explain how we develop. If you have just one protein that's going thrown out and saying, hey, this is what's going to happen, that's not how it works. There's a lot of like cell to cell communication. Like if you get, you know, a signal from your brain to your hand to say, hey, I need to move, there's a lot involved in that process. Cells and cell to cell communication is a huge deal. And the regulation of how these cells develop is incredibly powerful. Now, there are external influences on those cells, but how they communicate and how they integrate with each other is an incredibly important part of what I'm working on.
yeah. So it's not just like different cultures, different societies in a social way, but there's different environments that interact with your human biology in a physical way that also changes the prevalence of certain things in society.
Right. And no fault of anybody by any, circumstance whatsoever. It could just be it's hotter one day versus another. And that's actually interesting side note is in terms of sexual differentiation of other creatures like alligators and stuff like that, or turtles, it's the temperature of the water. So you have these different mechanisms that also come into play with this.
Yeah. So how do you guys feel when you see somebody waving a pride flag?
I feel great. I feel like I have a friend.
Yeah.
Yeah. Uh, I wrote this blog post a few years ago called "Pride is the opposite of shame," and so when I see someone waving a pride flag, or a rainbow flag, I think that person is healing from their shame,
Hmm.
or has healed from their shame. And when we use the word pride in the LGBTQ community, we're not using pride like in the Book of Mormon sense of like I'm better, like as the opposite of humility. Pride to us is the opposite of shame. It's the opposite of depression. It's the opposite of sadness. And so many of us, like almost universally, LGBTQ people have felt shame, self-hatred, wishing that we could be different or die. I was taught explicitly that my sexual orientation wouldn't be the same in the next life, and that just made me want to die. And so when I see someone waving a pride flag, I think that person is overcoming their shame. They are choosing to live, and that makes me so excited.
Yeah.
Oh, Christine, I have one more question that I need to ask. So if you and your wife and your kids are visiting another ward, you walk in, everyone's going to say, here's a lesbian couple with children. How should they respond when you walk into sacrament meeting?
Say hello. Be friends.
What?
Sit next to us. We're like totally not scary.
I mean, we're laughing because it's so obvious, Christine, but at the same time, I recognize that that's not going to be your experience with everyone you interact with.
No.
And that's hard. Every single time you go to church, that's something you have to put on your armor for, kind of,
You do. I was just released as the organist for our ward. I've been in the ward organist for several years, even before transition. So I actually had a very visible position up on the stand. And I got very anxious walking into the church every week or every other week because my schedule wouldn't allow me to do every week. But it was nerve-wracking. I had to gear myself up to go in there, sit in the front, and have people look at me and think whatever they wanted to think. So that kind of just spiraled in my head a little bit. So in all honesty, I'm actually kind of grateful that I was released because it took off a lot of pressure.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I still go, I still present as myself. And I have a lot of people that love and trust me.
Yeah. And Matt's question is kind of obvious, but it is something that I want to explore a little bit more as we head into Pride Month. What are some obvious outward actions that members of the church could do to communicate to the queer community that we're on your side, that we love you? I'm a high school teacher. I'm no longer allowed to hang a pride flag in my classroom. Thank you, Utah State Legislature. Like, to me, that was something that I could easily do to communicate to people that this was a safe and welcome space. What is something like that members of the church can do to say, like, obviously, I'm on your team?
I've got one thought that I'm stealing from a man named Ikaru, who's a Brazilian member of the church who's gay. He was recently a guest on my podcast, All Out in the Open, and he talked about light and how light contains every color. And it's not until that light is refracted that it then you can see all these different colors. And so light, it contains every color. And what's beautiful about rainbows is we're all there. Like all the diversity that exists in the color spectrum is there in the rainbow, and that's so beautiful. And so the pride flag, like I have a wristband that's the pride colors. But if someone just wants to do like show something rainbowy that isn't that same thing, I think that's great. Like I love rainbows because they include everyone and everything and are particles of light. And if you can't hang a pride flag, and if you don't want to, I think there are two important things that allies do.
Okay.
The first thing is they ask questions and they listen. So they learn. So gain knowledge, hear people's stories, and then they share what they learn. And so once you've learned, then share what you learn. And so one of the best ways that I feel seen, that I feel supported, is when people just like talk about LGBTQ people in natural, normal, organic, and positive ways. So if you're sharing a story of faith at church or a story about prayer, use an LGBTQ person as the example. Or you can even just like mention in passing, like a gay friend or a trans cousin, and just like let us be part of the conversation. It doesn't need to be like, hey everyone, just want to let you know, I talked to a trans person today. It doesn't have to be like that. but just like really like natural and organic ways. And I think that if we can just talk about LGBTQ people, then we know that we're in a place that's safe. And I just got one more thought, if you don't mind me sharing one more
Sure,
thought.
I love
Go
this.
for
Yeah.
it.
This a listener to my podcast emailed us a few years ago, and I had invited everyone to like pray and think about what they could do to support the LGBTQ community. And she got this inspiration to plant a little rainbow garden. So in front of her house, she planted flowers in like a rainbow pattern. And she's like, this seems so silly and so stupid. And so she's out there like watering this newly planted garden. And one of her neighbors walks by and she says, I love your flowers. And she says, I love them too. What do you love about them? And then this friend came up to her and said, my kid recently came out and it's been tough. And then they had this long, beautiful conversation. They cried, they hugged. And she said, it was just because I planted those rainbow flowers that I was able to have this conversation with someone. And so we just need to like really ponder and pray. Like, if there are people who feel marginalized, if there are people who feel unsafe, what is the thing I'm feeling inspired to do? And like, I would have never thought to plant a rainbow garden, but the Spirit knew that that's what she needed to do to minister to that friend in her neighborhood.
Beautiful. Beautiful. Yeah.
What about you, Christine?
I would say learn education for sure. That's what I'm doing. And I don't expect people to be at this doctorate and master's level of understanding of genetics and genomics and human development and things like that. But asking questions, in the Doctrine and Covenants, we talk about learning from the best books and things like that. That to me is part of my encouragement to continue doing this, to continue to learn, is to allow me to see people for who they are and allow them to be. I think that's very much part of the gospel.
What I'm going to say is going to sound super insensitive, and so I apologize for that in advance. But
I also apologize for Matthew in advance.
in the world that I live in, I meet a lot of young people who love to tell racist jokes. It's one of their favorite things to do, and they'll frequently look around and make sure that there's no racial minorities before they like lean into their racist jokes and laugh and laugh and laugh. And then occasionally I find the same kind of behavior where they'll make jokes about people in the LGBTQ community. And I say to them, if you think you don't have friends that are gay and transgender, like, you're totally wrong. Like, if you talk to somebody and they say, I don't know anybody like that, I think the truth is they actually do. And those people are watching them very closely to see how they behave, because it's going to signal to them something about, can I trust this person? Can I love this person? Is there evidence to suggest what I'm saying is true?
Oh, yeah, so much.
Absolutely.
I didn't know Christine before she transitioned, but I'm sure before she transitioned, she was male passing. I am like a tall man with a deep voice, who's not a singer or a dancer. I can play straight. And so some people were surprised. I also love the Golden Girls, so some people weren't surprised when I came out. But in a lot of ways, if we don't let you into our life, you're not going to know. And I've had some people say really horrific things about gay people around me, not knowing that I was gay. And before, I just took it. Like, I just let it sit with me. I let it wreck my day. And now I'll raise my hand or politely correct them and say something, because now I'm not afraid like I used to be. But the truth is, if you are in a group that has 10 people in it, statistically, there's going to, like, at least one of them is going to be LGBTQ. And that's not going to be in every group, but statistically, that's how it's going to be. So if you were in a room with 10 people, one of them is LGBTQ. And so you are constantly surrounded by us, because we are in your midst. We're in your families. We're in your neighborhoods. We're in your community. Like we are part of every group you're part of.
And if it's a young person and you don't know, they could be in this suicidal depressive stage. And what you're doing is making things much harder on them, completely inadvertently and unaware that you're doing that.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
For sure.
One of the best ways for these individuals, these youth, is to actually find their community. And that's actually one of the best ways to help them, is to allow them to be with their community and have access to people that they can talk to and relate to, away from those, harmful things that are being said. I mean, one patient that I had several years ago looked at me and said, "Oh, I remember you. You're the pedophile."
Oh, jeez.
And that still haunts me to this day. That is a common refrain that I see online and social media constantly. And I'm sure it's talked about it behind my back. But no, I'm not.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, so it's not even just how you respond and talk to people when they're open and out and you know that they're gay or lesbian or transgender or whatever. It's all the time, right? Love is
It's very
something you have to
frequent.
have for other people all the time, whether you
Mhm.
know it or don't know it.
Yeah, Matt, just one quick experience. So I've worked in the Provo Temple as a temple worker a few times before they tore it down, of course. And when you're in the temple, it's like no one has any information. Right? Like we're all even dressed the same. And so sometimes I would be, working with someone, or we'd be like waiting for a bail assignment or something. And so like, oh Ben, like how many kids do you have? And I was like, well, I don't have any kids. They're like, well, how long have you and your wife been married? Like, well, I'm not married. Actually, I'm gay. And 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 this happened so often, like people I'd worked with for months and months and months, like who I'd talked to, and then we just hadn't gotten to like, oh, tell me about your life, but we'd spent so much time together. And the reality is like there are people like all the time, like everywhere you are there are LGBTQ people, and we're serving with you, we're working with you, and we just want to live our lives, and we want to help make the world a better place just as much as you do.
Yeah, I love it.
Um, I have a personal question. We've been talking a lot about how we can be good to our queer friends who are members of the church. Do you have any advice on how we can be good members of the church to the queer people in our life who have left the church because it's so painful, because it's no longer something that feels good to them? Like for me, the church is still very important to me, but it's not more important than those people. And it's a hard balancing act.
Yeah. The first thing I would say is, Maya Angelou said that there's no greater pain than having an untold story inside of you. And if someone has chosen to leave the church, that was not a decision that they just made lightly. Especially if they were active and involved for years. And so, they might want to talk about it. They might want to share. And so if someone has chosen to step away from the church, I think most people, if you came up to them and said, hey, I just want to understand where you're coming from, I just want to hear your journey, would you mind sharing it? And just like, and listen, and let them share the pain, let them share the reason that they left, and just like hold that pain with them can be really powerful for a lot of people, and really healing. I can't tell you how many times I've had those conversations with queer friends of mine who have left the church, and they'll say, this is the first time anyone's asked that. Like
Mm-hmm.
no one's cared to know until now.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not because I'm a special person. I'm just naturally inquisitive and nosy. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
I think hearing someone's story, and then when we were baptized, we promised to mourn with those that mourn, to comfort those that stand in comfort, and to bear one another's burdens that they may be light. And so, if there's any sadness in them, like we have covenanted to hold that sadness with them. And my friend Tom Christofferson would want to add that we also promise to rejoice with those who are rejoicing. So whatever good thing is happening in their life right now, whatever they're excited about, like rejoice with them in that. Be excited with them about that. One of my dearest friends left the church a long time ago. He was very angry. We talked about it a lot, and then he met a man and was so excited about this man. And then I was like, I would love to meet him. And then I got to meet him, and it was great. And he was like so excited, and I'm just like so happy to be part of his life. And so, whatever our friends are doing that's bringing them joy, like let's participate in that. Like let's let them, like let their joy be something that we are going to rejoice in as well.
I love that. Thanks, Ben.
On my mission, we had the whole statement: build a relationship of trust. And it's just like how you build a friendship is they've stepped away, and there'll be times where you want to get that link back, but it's going to take time. Allow for healing, allow for space, and just build that friendship. It's not going to be something that's going to happen immediately, nor probably shouldn't. But at the same time, it's like reaching out to being a friend and just allowing that natural relationship to build, I think is also important too.
Yeah. Awesome. Thanks, you guys.
Yeah.
Ben,
And
do you want to
I'm
give us the website for the conference again?
Yes, the website is gather-conference.com. That's gather-conference.com. And just building off of what Melissa asked, my invitation for June this year, and I'm working on a blog post about this, is going to be to interview an LGBTQ person, like ask them to share their story. And I'm going to share some ideas on how to do that in a way that would be beneficial for you, but also a positive experience for the person in your life who is LGBTQ. Because just feeling heard, feeling seen is such a healing thing for us as humans. It's something
Yeah.
that we need and crave and that we can offer.
That's great. Hey, thanks so much for joining us, you guys. I really, really appreciate it. One of my favorite things about the Restored Gospel is that it's a broad tent. We want everybody in the church. And sometimes it feels like we don't want you. We really do want everybody. And it builds my faith to meet people who are faithful members of the church, because it's not always an easy thing to do. And I love to talk to people that are fighting the good fight. So thank you so much for joining us. Listener,
Thank you.
we'll talk to you again soon.